London, 30 October 1954. An ordinary long-distance call entered Britain's public telephone network and was routed 100 feet beneath Holborn. Through an exchange the caller was not supposed to know existed. Above ground, there was no sign of it. Below, the post office had installed thousands of trunk connections, emergency generators, and its own water supply. Kingsway looked like a government doomsday bunker. But the official explanation revealed in 1968 was more surprising. It had been built to prevent something far larger from failing. The address above ground was 32 High Holborn, a shopfront, no different from its neighbours. The entrance behind it led to a lift, and the lift dropped roughly 30 metres, past London Underground's central line, into two parallel tunnels, each 16.5 feet across and around 1,200 feet long. 4 further tunnels ran off them at right angles. By the time the exchange opened, it carried several thousand trunk lines, its own diesel generators, and an artesian well reaching down to the same water table that supplied breweries above. There was a restaurant, a bar, a games room. Staff could, in principle, live and work below Holborn without returning to the surface. None of this was visible from the street. The shopfront gave no indication of what lay beneath it, and the people walking past it on their way to lunch had no reason to imagine that a long-distance call placed from a red telephone box in Leeds or Bristol might, for a fraction of a second, pass through a switching room 100 feet under their feet. What the post office had built here did not begin with Kingsway. It began 14 years earlier, in a much smaller emergency, for a much more ordinary reason. The tunnels the post office eventually took over were not built for telephones at all. In October 1940, at the height of the Blitz, the government approved a programme of 8 deep-level shelters beneath London Underground stations, dug well below the existing tube tunnels so they could later be converted into new express railway lines if the war ended favourably. One pair, at Chancery Lane, ran east to west under High Holborn, 1 tunnel either side of the central line. Construction continued through 1942. Like several of the other deep shelters, it was never open to the public. It had been built to protect. Instead, during the war, it was used for undisclosed government and intelligence work, and after 1945, the tunnels held archive material for the Public Record Office, rather than sheltering anyone at all. The scheme to build 8 deep shelters beneath London had been approved specifically because ordinary tube platforms used unofficially as shelters throughout the Blitz could not accommodate everyone who needed protection, and because a shelter built well below the existing underground offered better protection from a direct hit. Chancery Lane's shelter, like several of its counterparts, was finished after the worst of the bombing had passed, and its planned use as shelter space for the public never fully materialized. What is documented is more modest: undisclosed departmental work during the war, followed by 4 years as a document store for the Public Record Office. Nothing in that sequence suggests the tunnels were ever intended, from the start, to become a telephone exchange. For 4 years, the tunnels sat as a wartime asset without a wartime use. In 1949, they passed to the General Post Office, the department that, at the time, ran both the postal service and the national telephone network. Nothing about the tunnels changed on the day of the handover. The same bare concrete, the same 2 long galleries, the same disused air raid infrastructure. What changed was the reason anyone wanted them. The post office was not looking for a bomb shelter. It was looking for a building the war had already taught it, in a different way, that it needed. What the war had taught the post office was straightforward. Buildings above ground could be destroyed, and a national telephone network is only as strong as the exchanges that switch its calls from one town to the next. London's trunk network before and during the war ran through ordinary exchange buildings at street level, connected by cables that surfaced at manholes and entered switch rooms no more protected than any other office block. A raid that hit the wrong building did not just silence one telephone line, it could sever the trunk connections that many other towns depended on to reach each other at all. Post office engineers were not simply speculating about this risk. The Blitz itself had already demonstrated it. A raid on the wrong exchange building, or on the cable routes converging at a handful of manholes, could take out trunk circuits, serving dozens of towns at once. And restoring service meant physically repairing whatever had been destroyed. with no alternative route available in the meantime. What changed after 1945 was the scale of the threat that same vulnerability now had to survive. By the early 1950s, this was no longer a hypothetical drawn from the Blitz. Civil defense planners were now working against the possibility of an atomic strike on a British city, and a single detonation could, in principle, do to a national exchange in an afternoon what months of conventional bombing had only partly managed. The lesson the post office drew was not dramatic language about apocalypse. It was an engineering conclusion. Some part of the trunk network, the part that connected regions to each other, not just households, to their local exchange, needed to survive an attack on the city built above it. Protected command posts already existed for the government. What Kingsway would supply was different. Continuity for the ordinary trunk call, the one placed by a shop, a hospital, a family, that had nothing to do with government business at all. That distinction, a facility built around protecting the public network rather than housing government command, would not become clear to Kingsway's own visitors for another 15 years. Work to convert the shelter into a telephone exchange began in 1951. The two original tunnels were extended by 4 further galleries running at right angles, built for switching equipment, cable distribution frames, and machinery that had no place in a wartime shelter, meant only to hold people. Engineers installed diesel generators capable of running the site independently of the surface power supply, sank a well for water, and fitted ventilation, designed to keep air moving through tunnels that had no natural airflow of their own. The Kingsway Trunk Exchange opened in October 1954, carrying several thousand trunk circuits that had previously depended entirely on surface buildings. Here is the payoff the shopfront on High Holborn never advertised. Kingsway was not built primarily to shelter ministers or to run a war from underground. Protected command facilities for government already existed elsewhere. Kingsway's job was narrower and, in its way, more ordinary. To make sure that if a British city's surface exchange was ever put out of action, the long-distance calls routed through it, calls between hospitals, calls between businesses, calls between a soldier's family and the exchange that connected them to a telephone box near his barracks, could still get through. The doomsday bunker appearance was real. The generators, the well, the sealed tunnels 100 feet down were not for show. But they existed in service of something far less cinematic than a nuclear command post, the uninterrupted working of Britain's ordinary trunk telephone service. If the idea of an entire hidden telephone city under a London shopfront is new to you, this channel spends every week on exactly this kind of overlooked British infrastructure, worth following if you want the next one when it goes up. Kingsway needed people to keep the exchange running, and those people worked in conditions unlike almost any other GPO posting. Staff descended by lift each shift, worked among racks of electromechanical switching equipment, lit by fluorescent tube lighting, and could, if duty required it, eat in a staff restaurant, use a bar, or pass free time in a games room without ever going back up to the surface. This was not incidental comfort. A facility designed to keep working if the city above it could not was, by the same logic, designed to keep its own staff working without depending on the surface for meals or rest. Staff were drawn from the same pool of trained GPO telecommunications engineers who worked surface exchanges across the country, rotated into Kingsway rather than recruited specifically for it. The equipment they maintained, relay banks, cable distribution frames, valve-era test apparatus, was the same generation of switching technology installed in ordinary exchanges above ground. What differed was the environment it operated in, sealed 100 feet down, dependent on mechanical ventilation rather than open windows, and reachable only by lift. The daily work itself was unglamorous, testing relay banks and trunk switching frames with valve-era equipment, tracing faults through dense cable racks, maintaining the generators and ventilation plant that made the tunnels habitable at all. None of the surviving accounts from post office engineers who worked at Kingsway describe secret missions or dramatic incidents. What they describe is closer to any other exchange posting routine testing, routine maintenance, long shifts, carried out 100 feet underground instead of at street level. The strangeness of the job was environmental, not operational. The same switching engineering the post office practiced everywhere else, performed in tunnels built to survive an attack that, as it turned out, never came. For the vast majority of calls that passed through it, Kingsway was invisible by design, not because the post office was hiding anything from the caller in that moment, but because trunk switching was never meant to be seen. A subscriber dialing a long-distance number in the 1950s and 1960s had no way of knowing, and no reason to ask, which physical exchange handled the call between the local exchange at each end. If the automatic trunk switching equipment routed that connection through Kingsway rather than through a surface exchange elsewhere in London, nothing about the call itself indicated it. The dialing tone sounded the same. The connection took the same few seconds. This invisibility deepened as the 1950s went on. Subscriber trunk dialing, introduced progressively from the late 1950s, let callers dial long-distance numbers directly rather than asking an operator to connect them, removing even the human intermediary who might once have known, in a general sense, which exchange a call had been routed through. The more automatic the network became, the more completely Kingsway's role in it disappeared from anyone's awareness but the engineers working inside it. The overwhelming majority of what Kingsway carried, day to day, was this kind of ordinary traffic: business calls, calls between relatives in different cities, calls that had nothing to do with government business or civil defense, and everything to do with the same reasons anyone picked up a telephone. This is the detail that the Doomsday Bunker appearance obscures. Kingsway's daily working life was not spent handling secret traffic. It was spent handling the same trunk calls that any exchange in the network handled, at the same volume the network as a whole was carrying, with the singular difference that this particular exchange could keep doing so if the surface around it could not. In 1956, Kingsway took on a second role. It became the London termination point for TAT1, the first transatlantic telephone cable, which for the first time gave Britain and North America a permanent voice circuit, instead of relying on unreliable long-wave radio links. Handling TAT1 traffic was not a simple matter of running one more cable into the tunnels. It required a coordinated arrangement across three separate London sites: Kingsway itself, the International Exchange at Wood Street, and the Continental Exchange at the Faraday Building, linked by several hundred paired copper circuits so that a transatlantic call could be switched correctly at each stage. Alongside this international civilian traffic, Kingsway also carried a small volume of sensitive government communications. Guides who later took post office visitors through the tunnels pointed out, among other things, that the Cold War telephone link between the White House and the Kremlin was routed through the exchange, along with lines connecting to Downing Street and the Cabinet Office. It is worth being precise about what this did and did not mean. Kingsway was not principally a government facility that also happened to carry ordinary calls. It was principally a public trunk exchange that also carried, among its thousands of ordinary circuits, a small number of highly sensitive government and international lines, the same tunnels doing both jobs for the same underlying reason. They had been built not to fail. Kingsway was never a solitary facility. It was one of three linked protected exchanges built across Britain in the 1950s. The others sited under Manchester and Birmingham. Manchester's version, carried out under the cover name Scheme 567, became known as the Guardian Exchange. Birmingham's, built between 1953 and 1957 at a cost of around £4 million, and known internally as Tunnel Scheme 526, became the Anchor Exchange, a network of tunnels roughly 750 feet long beneath the city centre, drawing its own water from an artesian well that tapped the same underground supply used by one of Birmingham's breweries. Guardian, sunk more than 35 metres beneath central Manchester in tunnels roughly 2 metres across, followed the same design logic as Kingsway and Anchor: hardened trunk switching capacity, its own power and water, kept apart from the surface network it was built to protect. A fourth exchange was long rumoured to exist beneath Glasgow, but no documentary evidence has ever confirmed it was built, and the Post Office's own later accounts describe only 3 completed underground exchanges: London, Manchester, and Birmingham. Anchor alone was built to handle 250,000 automatic calls a day, and its role as a fallback for Birmingham's main surface exchange was tested in earnest, if briefly, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when the post office prepared to seal the tunnels and put the facility on an emergency footing. That moment passed without Anchor, Kingsway, or Guardian ever being required to take over a city's telephone traffic outright. What all three shared was the same underlying design: protected trunk switching capacity, held in reserve, in case the surface network above any one of Britain's major cities was ever knocked out of action at once. For 14 years, none of this appeared in print. The Post Office had classified Kingsway, Guardian, and Anchor under a defence notice, a formal request to editors not to publish information that could damage national security, and newspapers observed it. That changed on 21 October 1968, when the Postmaster General answered a written parliamentary question asking, plainly, why the existence of 4 underground telephone exchanges had been withheld from the public since roughly 1954. The official answer, recorded in Hansard, was direct. The exchanges had been provided as part of national civil defence planning and had therefore been covered by a defence notice. Since Kingsway, Anchor and Guardian had now lost their defence significance, there was no longer any reason to withhold knowledge of their existence, and the information was accordingly released. Secrecy did not end cleanly on the day of the parliamentary answer. Some staff and contractors, with knowledge of the exchanges, were reportedly still required to sign the Official Secrets Act into the 1970s, even after the facilities themselves had been openly discussed in the press. Within a year, the Post Office was taking journalists on guided tours. British Pathé filmed inside the exchange in 1968, showing switching equipment in operation without disclosing the location. In November 1969, the Post Office's own staff newspaper, The Courier, ran a feature on what it called a telephone city under London. What the declassification did not reveal was a secret command bunker stripped of its cover story. It revealed exactly what the engineering had always been: a protected extension of the ordinary trunk network, built for a Cold War threat that, by 1968, the Post Office itself judged had passed. Kingsway kept working through the 1960s and into the 1970s, modernized in stages as trunk switching technology itself moved on. What eventually made the underground exchange obsolete was not a single new invention, but the accumulated effect of decades of change in how trunk calls were switched, newer exchanges elsewhere in the network, digital switching gradually replacing the electromechanical equipment Kingsway had been built around, and a national telephone system that no longer depended on protecting a handful of hardened sites the way it had in the 1950s. Closure came in stages through the 1980s rather than on a single date. Permanent staff were withdrawn, the site was placed on care and maintenance status, and asbestos insulation used throughout the original wartime construction was later found to be present in hazardous quantities, complicating any future use of the tunnels. In 2008, British Telecom confirmed the site was being offered for sale. The switching frames that had once carried thousands of ordinary trunk calls a day were, by then, silent. Return, for a moment, to that ordinary long-distance call on the evening of 30 October 1954, the one that entered the public network from somewhere in Britain, was switched automatically through Kingsway and reached whoever it was calling with no delay, no interruption, and no indication to either party that their voices had passed through 100 feet of protected tunnel beneath Holborn. That caller never knew Kingsway existed. That was, in the most literal sense, the point. A facility built to look like the country's most secret defensive asset had, in its daily and unremarkable operation, one purpose above all others: making sure an ordinary telephone call went through. If you'd like to see how Britain protected the rest of its communications network during the Cold War, the next video in this series is on the channel now.